evening, everyone. Welcome to another fantastic night with the Virtual Tasting Society. I am Jane Kilkenny, subbing for Vadim Perlavsky, who is once again traveling around the planet and not drinking with us. Tonight, we are thrilled to have Caitlin Bartlemay from Clear Creek Distillery. Did I get that right?
Nailed it.
Awesome. Yay, go me. Okay, so little housekeeping rules. Most of you have been here before, you know the drill. We're here to learn things, get nerdy. Please feel free to ask questions. Make sure you keep yourself on mute though when you're not talking so that we don't have to listen to your cats fight in the background. So with that, everyone, this is Caitlin. Caitlin, take it away.
Hello. So I've been warned the first thing you guys are going to want to know is the tasting order. So before I do any introductions of both myself and the distillery, let's talk about the order of events. We're going to start with the pear brandy. And then I should probably peek around the corner, although I should do this off the top of my head. So it should be pear brandy, blue plum, Kirschwasser. And then we're going to do the American pot still brandy, the framboise, the raspberry brandy, and then the last one will be the eau de vie of Douglas fir. That's 6. That should be everybody, yeah? Okay.
Yep, that's all of them.
They're by and large in order of what your palate is going to handle, with the exception of the pear brandy. It is really powerful, but it's what we make the most of. It's our flagship. It's what Clear Creek is really known for. So we always start with that because it's a great way to start the discussion on what fruit brandy is, what brandy that is called eau de vie is, and how the production process works behind everything that we make. So we always start with the pear brandy. All right, everybody organized? Cool. Okay, so like Jane said, my name is Caitlin Bartlemay. I'm the head distiller for Clear Creek Distillery. I've been with the distillery for 13 years at the end of June. We have gone through a lot of changes and then again, no changes. In the 13 years that I've been there, the distillery is actually the 3rd craft distillery in the country behind Germain-Robin and St. George. Our founder, Steve McCarthy, who passed this January, was actually trained by Jorg Rupf. So there's a little bit of a, there used to be there was a rivalry between Jorg and Steve. I think that it's really hysterical that the production teams of both distilleries currently are the best of friends. We would sometimes say that we don't know where the hatchet has been buried, and we're not sure that it has been. But certainly the current teams behind both St. George and Clear Creek are good friends. We make a lot of similar things. We make a lot of things that are very different. The craft world is a great place for a lot of good people to make delicious things to put in our glasses. I have a degree in food science from Oregon State. I have a farming background and a wine background. A lot of people say that seemingly I was crafted from day one to be a craft distiller. But for me and my personal experience, I essentially just fell one step at a time down a staircase into craft distilling. So we'll see how the rest of my career goes, but so far it's been great. So like I said, Clear Creek founded in 1985 by Steve McCarthy. Before there was hashtags and before there was trendy marketing words, the whole point of Clear Creek Distillery was what we now know is value-added agriculture. So he had family that lived in the Hood River Valley. He had fallen in love with pear brandy while he was traveling through Europe with a separate company, and his family was having a hard time getting rid of pears. It was right around the decline of the consumption of fruit cocktail. Weird, right? That all of a sudden people stopped eating fruit cocktail, but all of a sudden there were all these beautiful Hood River pears that weren't really getting a fair price on the market. And so he was like, hey, wouldn't it be great if I started making pear brandy? Distilling can't be that hard. So he paid Jorg Rupf $85,000 to train him how to make eau de vie on a still that he bought from Germany. And the rest is history. In 2014, we were purchased by Hood River Distillers. Steve was ready to retire at the ripe age of 72. And since then, we have moved to the Hood River Valley to be closer to the pears that we make this beautiful pear brandy out of. We consume, actually, we did the math fairly recently, we consume 0.25% of all the pears that come out of the Hood River Valley. which doesn't seem like a whole lot, but Hood River is one of the biggest producers of Bartlett pears in the United States. So the fact that it's an easy number to say out loud is kind of cool. That being said, we processed last year over 600,000 pounds of Bartlett pears into pear brandy. A full 750 bottle of pear brandy actually takes 20 pounds of pears to create. So actually technically it comes in 2 truckloads. 2 truckloads of pear bins, 58,000 pounds, makes just over a cage tank, which is like 250 gallons of pear brandy at still strength. So we're really good at making a lot of stuff, not a lot of stuff. So before I get more into, what makes an eau de vie, what makes it brandy, and how pear brandy is made, let's go ahead and take a sip of your pear brandy if you haven't had it. So a lot of information was lost in the seemingly short amount of time that Prohibition was around. Prohibition lasted 13 years. And after that 13 years, Americans forgot almost everything about the culture and their own culture and history about spirits and about alcohol and cocktails. And there's a number of terms that were completely and totally redefined, and those definitions only exist within the United States. One of them is the word for, well, 2 of them, brandy and schnapps. So the consumers at large think that brandy is supposed to be sweet. They think that brandy has to be aged, and probably think that brandy has to be made from grapes. As a matter of fact, everything is a brandy that's made from fruit, but if it's made from grapes, it can also be called an eau de vie. But if you make it from grapes, it can't be called an eau de vie. It also doesn't have to be sweet, and it doesn't have to be aged. The pear brandy is 80 proof and bone dry, and tastes and smells directly of Bartlett pears. And the neat thing about how we make our pear brandy and how most pear brandies are made is we're actually making the brandy from the whole Bartlett pear. So it's not just the smell of the juice of a Bartlett pear, it's the smell of the skin, it's the smell of the seeds, it's the smell of the flesh of the Bartlett pear. So when you take a sip of it, while it is 80 proof and unaged and there is no sugar in it, so it's a little bit powerful, you really get that dry tannic sensation of the skin of the pear, as well as the viscosity and you can almost reach for the sweetness of a ripe Bartlett pear itself within the glass of pear brandy. Any questions now that you've tasted it, or shall we dig into how it's made?
I think this is fantastic. This is good.
Okay, so like I said, we bring in pears 58,000 pounds at a time. Interestingly, pears actually don't ripen on trees. Bartlett pears have to be tricked into, well, if a Bartlett pear was to ripen on a tree, it has to go through a few cold, frosty mornings before the enzymes in the pear wake up and start breaking the starches down into fermentable sugars. Lucky for us, we have cold storage and refrigeration, so we can harvest the pears off of the trees when they're super indestructible and essentially pear-shaped pieces of wood, and then bring them into cold storage and make them feel like they've had this yummy cold fall frosty morning. And those enzymes won't wake up until the pear warms up again, as if the sunshine has blown all the frost off the trees and it's time to wake up and become a delicious sweet pear. So we bring in 58,000 pounds at a time, and they're all green. And over the years, we have developed a way to ripen 58,000 pounds of pears all together, all at once, so that they're the peak of ripeness, bin after bin after bin after bin. What it takes is closing up the distillery and cranking up the heat and cranking up the humidity. So even if it is December in Hood River, Oregon, at the base of Mount Hood, and there is 2 feet of snow on the ground, and you're literally trudging through the snow with your snow boots and all of your hats and gloves, you come into the distillery, and if there's pears in there, you have to doff everything and keep your tank top on, because it is sunny Hawaii essentially on the inside, because if the pears are in the building, the pears are king. It takes between 6 and 8 days to ripen those pears. Master distiller Joseph O'Sullivan and I have been doing this for so long, between the two of us, combined 33 years of distilling experience, that when we open the door into the distillery and we take a whiff of the offices before we even see the distillery, we can tell whether or not it's going to be pear crush day just by the aroma in the offices alone. It changes from, I mean, really the smell of a green pear. You can smell some of that underripeness, some of that like dusty quality of being underripe. And then on crush day, you walk in through the office door and it's like you're just wading through a mist of pear juice. The air smells as sweet and ripe as the pears themselves. If any of you have ever bitten into a ripe Bartlett pear, there is nothing to it. There's hardly any structural integrity to it at all, which means that when we crush those pears, we just run them through a pump, and the action of them falling into a pump and getting pumped through a hose is what actually crushes them. And the only thing that we do is add yeast. So what you're tasting in the glass really is pure Hood River sunshine that we can then ship the world around and share with everyone.
What kind of yeast do you use?
The yeast kind.
Okay, that's fine.
There are very, very, very few things that we don't that we won't share.
Understandable.
We do not share our yeast strain. It's not particularly special, but you know,
Okay.
everybody's allowed to have 5 secrets, and the yeast that Clear Creek uses is one of them.
Okay, now I'm going to ask you a different question, which shouldn't be so secretive. Do you use the same yeast on all of your brandies, or do you change it up? Okay.
One yeast to rule them all.
Okay.
Because of the distillation process, we don't add any sulfur to any of our ferments. So if you were to add sulfur to the ferment, you would be essentially neutralizing any wild yeast or bacterial growth within the ferment, stuff that comes in on the skin of the fruit itself. Because of distilling, that sulfur will come out in the distillation. So any free SO2 that you have in there will come out and will overwhelm you. It'll just smell like kind of like cleaning products and like hot pennies. So we can't add any of that, which means that we're over pitching the yeast. And by doing that, we're overwhelming any of the natural populations of wild yeast and bacteria within that ferment. And then our super good, yummy yeast take over and eat all the sugar before they can even really get a good foot forward. So it's kind of managed. It's kind of like guerrilla warfare. We got to get our good yeast to sneak in there and establish ground before the bad guys get in. But we're turning things over really quickly. So it takes about a week to ripen those pears. It takes 2 weeks to do the fermentation, and then it takes about 2 weeks to distill that whole 58,000 pounds of pears into pear brandy. So we don't hold on to things very long, and we keep crazy busy. Pears don't actually last that long, as we all know. And so we start making pear brandy. We start pulling pears into the distillery after they've been in cold storage for a few weeks. And then we try to get as much pear brandy made as we can by the middle of February. Some years we make as much as we wanted to make, and some years we don't, but that's the only shot that we have to make pear brandy for that whole production season. So if Oprah puts pear brandy on her list of the best things ever, and all of a sudden there's a run on pear brandy and we run out in February, sorry, we'll see you next October. That's when we'll probably have more pear brandy in a bottle. So everything that Clear Creek makes, we're really deeply tied to the fruit season. We're also really deeply tied to the community and the growers within the community. We're on a first name basis with all of our growers. Our pear consumption is so much that there's actually no one orchard that can supply us with all of the pears we would need. So we actually work with a sorting house that brings in pears from all the orchards throughout the Hood River Valley, and then we buy from them. But it is really important for us that all of the orchardists that we work with, all the berry farmers, that they feel that sense of ownership that we also feel in what we do, because what we're really trying to do is preserve and translate their hard work to share it with other people.
You're forgetting one important thing that also happens during your pear brandy making experience.
Oh, I mean, are you talking about the Instagram thing?
Oh yeah, totally.
Okay. See, okay. So what happened was, I think I didn't really give Joseph a the introduction that he deserves. He wanted to be here tonight. He is actually going to be presenting on the neurochemistry of memory and smell next week at Brooklyn. I can't remember, what does it stand for? BCB. Anyways, it's in New York. And so he is trying to get all of his interviews done for his presentation, and he's got a couple tonight, so he wasn't able to be here. But Joseph O'Sullivan is the master distiller of Hood River Distillers and Clear Creek Distillery. He has 18 years of distilling experience. He started with Clear Creek Distillery in 2005. In 2009, he moved to New York and helped build a few breweries and distilleries, and ended up being the head distiller at Green Hook Gin Smiths in Brooklyn. He was the man that distilled the first drop of legal alcohol post-prohibition in New York City. And then he moved back to Hood River, or he moved back to Portland and Hood River because the opportunity to be the head distiller of Clear Creek when we moved to Hood River came up, and he always wanted to return to the brand that started it all. That's always where his passion lied. So he came back in 2017 and is still with us today. So what Anna alluded to, Joseph had an injury, and during his injury, he was trying to pass the time healing by teaching himself how to draw. And he was drawing pears, fairly voluptuous pears with lower back tattoos for fun. And he sent it to the marketing team, and that was before the distilling team had managed to wrest control of the Instagram account. And so the marketing team actually decided that the drawings were so much fun that they posted them on the Clear Creek Instagram page, and they went wild. And thus the Clear Creek annual pear butt competition was born. So throughout the pear season, whenever we see a pear that has a particularly lovely backside, we will snap pictures of it. And then at the end of the season, there's a big competition, vote for your favorite on the Instagram page. I don't particularly think that the marketing team and the leadership team are super thrilled by it. However, it's one of those give the people what they want situations. It is the post that gets the most people excited for the whole calendar year is the pear butt competition. So look for that on Instagram in like March of every year.
That's hilarious. Tracy was wondering, as someone that is not very familiar with fruit brandy, what is the best way to serve?
So a lot of these are meant to be digestifs, which means that you would have them neat in a glass after dinner. If it is the summertime, which we are quickly approaching, we suggest that you keep the pear brandy in the freezer and serve out of the freezer. We generally have pear brandy in the freezer at the distillery at all times, because even in the dead of winter, like I said, it's pretty hot in there. So we kind of stretch the summer rules to be all year round. It will loosh a little bit when it's in the freezer. We do chill filter all of our brandies, but being in the freezer for that long, you'll get a little bit of cloudiness when you pour it out of the freezer. But it adds some really beautiful viscosity to it, and the cloudiness goes away within about a minute or two. It's really great in a quick brandy sidecar. There's any number of things you can do with it. There are a number of bar accounts that swear by using the pear brandy like seasoning. So even adding a teaspoon or a quarter teaspoon in a cocktail adds out this fruity sweetness that you're never going to be able to pull out. You put pear brandy in this cocktail, but it's that finishing touch that brings the whole cocktail together. As we go through, if I don't remember to give you a cocktail recipe or what you could do with it, feel free to prompt me, because there's a few of these that have some really great recipes for it. But brandies are super versatile, and they show up in lots of cocktail books, recipe books, as well as like baking books. I tell my friends and my doctors, because it's true, I mostly only drink at work. And so more often than not, if I'm going to open a bottle of something that I make at home, it's because I'm going to cook with it or I'm going to bake with it. So there's a lot of really fun things that you can do with these flavorful brandies in the kitchen as well. Well, are we ready to move on to the next one? Okay, so I believe I said that was supposed to be Blue Plum.
Yes, indeed.
So I gotta go around the corner and pour myself a new glass.
Okay. I copied Vivian's labels on the tasting order in case anybody's trying to figure out if she uses the other name for it.
Hey, Jane, I'm hearing an echo when you talk.
I can't do anything about that.
Okay, blue plum brandy. Have any of you guys ever had a blue plum brandy before? So we make ours from the Italian blue plum. Like I said earlier, we work with our local community and all of our local farmers and growers. Everything that Clear Creek makes, the fruit comes from within 200 miles of the facility. So these blue plums are grown in the Willamette Valley, which, if you don't know the geography of Oregon very well, is just like the next valley over from us. We get them pitted while we have the facilities and the stills and the drains to be able to handle cherry pits. Blue plum pits are a different story. So this is made from just the flesh and the skin of the blue plum, and it does not include the pits. Go ahead and give it a smell. This is the distiller's favorite brandy. It's one of the ones that is the most direct translation from the experience that you get with the fruit all the way to the brandy, which is saying something considering that the pear brandy really does taste like taking a bite of a perfectly ripe Bartlett pear. This smells and tastes exactly like a blue plum. It never changes. The fermentation, the smell never changes. Throughout the distillation process, the smell never changes. So it's this really great preservation of the fruity and floral notes that you get in the blue plum. We also really like it because while it is fruity and floral, it also has this really nice buttery and savory quality to it. And so it lends itself to both fruity brandy cocktails, as well as it does experimenting with stuff that's a little bit more savory. Slivovitz is a spirit that at one point in time, many different cultures and countries were trying to claim it as their own. It's really important to the Jewish community. It's not made from grapes or grain, which means that you can drink it and consume it in celebration of Passover. Slivovitz is actually the Slovakian name for what this is. Svečkinwasser is what it's called in Germany. Plums are incredibly ubiquitous. They grow all the way out through like former Eastern Bloc countries, all the way down through Turkey. They grow everywhere. And it's therefore important to all of those cultures that these trees grow from. If you've ever been around a plum tree, they grow so many plums. They make a huge mess. One tree alone, like a whole family couldn't manage to keep up with the plums from a single tree, which means that if you have a tree, almost certainly you were going to be making brandy out of it because you had to do something with all of that fruit. And so anyway, all these countries, all these cultures, they try to wade in and say, well, no, Slivovitz is mine, and no, it's important to me and my culture, and no, this is definitely something that, you know, our people have been making for centuries and nobody else can have it. Slivovitz is ours. And the EU actually had to wade in and smack some faces around and say, look it, this is going to be one of those things that belongs to everybody. And so it really is to us the spirit of the people. It's the spirit of the farmer. It's the spirit of the orchardist in our minds. We have a few really fun stories when it comes to our blue plum brandy. One in particular is Joseph's. He was working in the tasting room several years back now, and this man comes in and he just walks straight to the tasting table. He doesn't look at anything else. He doesn't say hello. He doesn't do anything. And he sets his hand on the table and he says, I hear you make Slivovitz. And don't judge my accent. It's terrible. But through his accent, Joseph was able to infer that he was definitely at a minimum Eastern European, if not, Russian or something. And he was like, yeah, we do. Would you like to try it? And he just kind of looks at him. And so Joseph pours him a taste of it, and he smells it, takes a sip, and he slams the glass down. And he goes, this is Slivovitz in a skirt. And he just like turns around and he just leaves the tasting room. And so Joseph loves to say that it's wonderful that we managed to make a slivovitz that challenges the masculinity of a person that comes in to taste it. Because of the variation of the people that make slivovitz, some people leave the pits in, some people don't, depending on the still and depending on the fermentation. Some of them are a little bit more smooth. Some of them are known to be incredibly rough. Unfortunately for that gentleman that day, ours was too nice and too smooth and too floral, and it upset him. The other fun story about our slivovitz is that in the early 2000s, Steve McCarthy got a letter in the mail, and it said, "Hello, we're from the International Slivovitz Competition, and we would like you to enter in your slivovitz and to be judged in the next couple months." And the competition was in Duluth, Minnesota. And Steve was like, "All right, there's no way that there's an international slivovitz competition in Duluth, Minnesota." But loving, being a scamp himself and loving a good game, he was like, "This is almost certainly some like weird college nerds in a garage somewhere trying to get free bottles of slivovitz." But he was like, "You know what? Good on them. This is a clever scheme." We sent them their 2 bottles. Didn't think anything of it. A few months go by, we get another letter in the mail, and we pull it out, and they actually, it was like, wow, they actually bothered to print out an award that said, "Congratulations, you won first place in the International Slivovitz Award." And we were like, wow, what the effort in this scam, this is amazing. We put it in a drawer, didn't think anything of it. The next year, same letter, we're like, 2 years in a row, you guys are dedicated to loving Blue Plum Brandy. Here's your 2 bottles. Keep being fans. High five. We get another first place award. Third year, same thing. But the third year, there was a second letter with our first place award. And that was the first time that we actually bothered to fire up the old internet and look and see if there was anything on this International Slivovitz competition. And turns out it actually was the International Slivovitz competition. And the second letter that came with our third first place prize was, "Here's the deal. Your slivovitz is great. You keep winning. Good job on you, but you're not allowed to play anymore." And so they decided to set us as the standard by which all other slivovitz would be judged by. So we don't hold a lot of stock in, who's first place, who's second place. There's a lot of room on the shelf for anybody when it comes to awards, and what one person really likes, another person might not. And so who are we to say what's best or what's not? But that one in particular really meant a lot to the distilling team. The fact that, a group of individuals had decided that ours was so good that distilleries across Europe that had been making slivovitz for hundreds of years had to be judged against ours was something really special. So the slivovitz will always hold a really close space in our hearts. And to round it out, it makes one hell of a daiquiri, and I am not ashamed to admit that it's even better if you blend it. Any other questions, comments? What do you think?
I'm not normally a plum fan, but I could probably be talked into drinking this rather more often. So it's actually really interesting. I can't even imagine how cool it would be in a daiquiri. I bet that's
man, it's so good. But especially like a nice hot summer day, put it in a blender with ice and some lime and a little bit of sugar. Oh, scary good.
Yeah, I'm in.
I came a little late, so I'm sorry if I missed. But what's like the when you distill it? What proof is to distill to? And when it's, I assume, proof down to 80. What do you guys use something special to proof it down?
So everything that we're trying tonight is at 80, with the exception of the Doug Fir. The Doug Fir is at 95.46 for reasons that I'll get into later. Depending on the fruit is depending on what the bulk proof is going to be. When you're distilling, if you can imagine it kind of like a line graph. So you always start out quite high, and then you want to try to manipulate your heat and your cooling water so that you maintain your proof fairly high, and then you want it to just drop. You want it to kind of look like a cliff, and you don't want to look at like a straight diagonal line where it's like proof over time. But that bulk proof will change depending on the amount of available alcohol that you have in whatever mash you're distilling. So for instance, the bulk proof on cherries is always, it's always over 150. It's somewhere around 155 for the bulk proof. But the pear brandy, there's a lot less fermentable sugars in pears than there are a perfectly sweet Bing cherry. And so the bulk proof on pear brandy tends to be, you know, between 138 and 140. So if there's more alcohol to be had, then you will get a higher bulk proof as well as getting more volume.
And then the water that you use to proof it down, is it like from a special place, or is
So we are very fortunate in that, yes, it is from a special place, but it also happens to be the same special place that the water that comes out of the tap that I drink at work and the water that comes out of the tap that everybody washes their clothes in and waters their lawns with is all really exceptional. So that's another really amazing thing about having a distillery in Hood River, Oregon, is that all of the water comes from the Elliott and Co glaciers on Mount Hood, and that's what actually refills the aquifers that we all pull our water from. So it's really minerally neutral. It's super clean and crisp. The only thing that we do to the cutting water is it goes through a quick charcoal filtration to remove what the city adds. So that little bit of chlorine that the city adds is removed at the distillery before it's used in final product. But lucky for us, yeah, it's beautiful, clean, clear, you know, glacial spring-fed water. But it's also the water that waters the lawn and the garden as well.
Can you
Think you
talk about
said
your stills, Caitlin?
So Clear Creek initially started with just two Arnold Holstein column or pot and column stills. They're a hybrid still. So they're German brandy stills made to make German brandy, to make European brandy. They each hold 60 gallons. So for instance, if you put 60 gallons of pear mash in one of our Arnold Holstein pot stills, you will only get about 3.5 gallons of still strength pear brandy out of it. But because of that fact, that it's a hybrid still with a pot and a column, we're able to do that in a single pass. So the column that's on top of the pot, each one of the sections of that column, which is usually represented by the window that they each have, acts as kind of like another distillation. The distillate changes from vapor to liquid to vapor to liquid every time it moves up through that column, and it loses a little bit of heat as it moves through that column, which means you have to be increasingly more volatile in order to escape that system. So what that column is doing is it's continuing to sort out the water from all of your alcohols as you go through that column. So the distillate that you get on the other side is at 140 proof instead of coming out much lower and then having to do a secondary distillation like you would if it was just a straight up pot still. We used to be direct fire before we moved to Hood River. We were crazy people and they were all direct fire stills as well. But with the move to Hood River, we've converted to steam.
so you have 4 of those?
Yeah, so we started with 2 in 1985, and then we bought the 3rd and 4th in 2006 and 2008 with the move to our second facility, which was just a little further down from where we started in Portland. And then we moved them all to Hood River and added to the whole production facility a 500-gallon vodka still from Carl.
So those 4 stills are the same ones that are used for McCarthy's?
Yep. That's one of the other really fun things about McCarthy's is that it's made on brandy stills and distilled in a single pass. So it's a really heavy spirit. And that's why all of these brandies are so flavorful, is that because it's a single pass distillation. So they keep all of those volatiles, they keep all of those flavors and aromas and oils, and they're not sorted out. So they're a very viscous, heavy, flavorful spirit.
I think you also said that the pear was like a 2-week fermentation.
Mm-hmm.
Is that similar for the plum?
Yeah, that's pretty much the same for all of the fruits. Sometimes apple takes a little bit longer, mostly because the apples come in and we can crush them as soon as they come out of cold storage. But that means that the mashes start out at like 40 degrees. So it takes a little bit of time for the action of the yeast consuming sugar to start heating up the whole mass of the fermentation, and then it really starts to get going. So apple sometimes has like a 3 or 4 day delay as it's warming up. And we are more of a winery than we are what people think of as a distillery, because we don't do any grain handling. We could pivot with all the equipment that we have in the facility and be just do wine tomorrow. We have all of that equipment. We don't have a mill. We don't have a mash tun. We don't have a way to like bring mass volumes of water to boil in order to brew anything. So everything that we do, all the language that we use is really borrowed from the wine world. Those ferments being from whole fruit, we're actually having to do what was called punch downs. So in order to manage those fermentations, we have this, it's a big steel disc on a big steel stick. And throughout the fermentation process, the CO2 that's released from the yeast will actually float all of the pulp to the top of the fermentation vessel. And if you don't push that back into the ferment, one, you're not regulating your temperature. So the potential that your ferment overheats and then you have a kill event on your yeast is really high. So you don't want to do that. So you want to be able to mix that material in and regulate the temperature of the fermentation. You also want to make sure that any available flavors and aromas and sugars that are in all of that pulp that floats to the top are mixed into the ferment. And then also by mixing, you're adding oxygen into the main body of the ferment, and yeast need oxygen in order to replicate and ferment and not create a bunch of weird off flavors and then just create super yummy ethanol for us to go ahead and grab out with the stills. So punch downs happen once a day for all of our fruit fermentations, which means that we all go to the gym to make sure that we can stay extra strong so that we can do that work. All right, are we ready for Kirsch?
Yes.
Okay, get your cherry brandies out. I'll be right back. Okay. So the label says cherry brandy. It also says Kirschwasser. The reason being is that Kirschwasser is the German name for cherry brandy, and it shows up a great deal in cocktail recipes and baking books by that name. Kirschwasser is an important ingredient in traditional Swiss fondues. It's a traditional ingredient in a Black Forest cake and in a myriad of other baked goods. So it's really important that we keep the old world's name on there as well as the word cherry brandy on there, so that if you're like, oh, I found my old grandma's recipe and it says Kirschwasser, like, and you find out that it's a brandy and you go to the liquor store, we want to make sure that people are like, all right, I'm looking for Kirschwasser, not cherry brandy. And then you see that second label and you're like, ah, it's the same thing. I can do it. I can go home and make grandma's recipe. Kirschwasser is, I don't know if I should say this out loud since it's being recorded, my least favorite. Mostly it's my least favorite because cherries and cherry brandy season are during the absolute peak of the heat here in the Pacific Northwest. Which means that I've got several thousand pounds of fermenting cherry in the building when it's also 100 degrees. And then I've got to distill all of it. And the stills are essentially giant radiators. And cherry distilling is a lot of work. So we have a thermometer on the wall so that we can make sure that we don't get too unsafe. But cherries is a huge amount of labor for a spirit that certainly we think is loved by all. The interesting thing about cherry is that it's actually fermented and distilled on the pit. If you were to pit these cherries and then try to make a brandy out of it, it would taste kind of like flabby, burnt nothing ethanol. It would have kind of some sulfur notes that would remind you of something that's been burnt. And there really wouldn't be a whole lot of character or flavor to it. A great deal of what you're getting in that glass actually comes from the pit of the cherry itself, which is why it's important that we include them in the fermentation, in the distillation. By including them in everything, that means that we have the plumber and Roto-Rooter on speed dial. We have their personal phone numbers. Usually we manage to get through a cherry season by only having to get the whole building unclogged 3 times. I think maybe once we've done it with only clogging the building twice. But I think that's the other reason that I don't particularly care for it, is there's always a little bit of anxiety of, am I going to get to go home on time today? Or am I going to be here because the whole building is clogged? So there's a little bit of roll the dice risk every day throughout the whole of the cherry distilling process. But because of those pits, you're getting all of these beautiful notes of almond and marzipan, all of these like, rich black forest kind of flavors. And then there's that flash of ripe red fruit towards the end.
I have a question about the pits.
Mhm.
It has cyanide in it. How does that not come through?
So one, cyanide is a really big particle. And so the amount of energy it would take to get it to escape the distilling process would actually destroy the cyanide poison itself. So it can't come through the distillation process. Two, and the most important thing is that cyanide component actually comes from the kernel within the pit. So not the outside part, but the little white kernel of the pit itself. And because of the pump that we use, even though those pits actually travel through that pump twice, once when they're crushed, and then again when they travel to the stills, it's called a progressive cavity pump, and it doesn't actually break the pits open. I can tell you as a person that has, and Joseph can also say this because Joseph's also like cleaned out his fair share of still floor drains, still drain receivers, and the bottom of fermentation tanks. It is incredibly rare to see a broken cherry pit after it's been through that pump. It's just enough, the cavity on our progressive cavity pump is just enough that it just kind of tears the fruit apart. And then the heat and the action of the fermentation process continue to break down the fruit. And then you get this, wonderful, really liquidy fruit mash that you can then distill. We mix up the pits so they kind of, come up in the tank. So we get a little bit of pits in every distillation load. There's usually only like 3/4 of an inch to an inch of pits of sediment on the bottom of a fermentation tank, which is not a whole lot considering that there's about 15,000 pounds of cherries in each fermentation tank. So most of them do go in the stills and then go down the drains, much to the chagrin of our poor drainage system. But yeah, we don't worry about it. We have gotten it tested. There is the cherry brandy is not going to kill you. It's not poisonous, but it's a great question. And it's one that we answer all the time. Any other thoughts on cherry brandy? I can't remember if I told you guys. We make them from ripe red Bing cherries. And the cool thing about having these great relationships with our farmers, I think for both us and for our farmers, the cherries that we use to make our Kirschwasser are the last cherries that come off the tree, and they can pick them without the stems. So cherry growers get a much higher price for their cherries if they can pick them and leave the stem on them, because we all have this idea that they're even better when you can eat them out of the bag and have the stem. So they get to harvest them faster without the stem, and the last cherries that are left over come to us. So there's usually, 5 to 10% of the cherries in those bins have been hanging on the tree for long enough they've just started to raisin, which for a consumer buying cherries out of the bag, you'd probably be like, oh, this one's starting to shrivel up and dry up, and throw it away. For us, those cherries are the most full of flavor and full of sugar cherry that you will ever have the opportunity to eat. So we always manage to make ourselves sick on cherries. Every year we swear we're not going to do it again. But having access to the most ripe and beautiful tree ripened fruit is just a recipe for disaster, unfortunately. But it makes really beautiful brandy.
How would you serve this in a cocktail?
Cherry brandy is even more savory than the blue plum brandy. So again, it's going to play really well with, you can add it to a little bit of your Manhattan. It has some of those kind of nutty and cherry qualities to it. You can add it as a spice ingredient to add that nutty flavor to a lot of different stuff. I would sneak some into a coffee martini, right? Because it will add a little bit more of that full character and flavor. Some of those things that we're actually looking in like a really good coffee and maybe might not get in whatever coffee liqueur you're using in that. So the sky's really the limit for brandies. in particular for the cherry brandy. Again, it's really common in cooking. It's one of the ones that comes up in that we get tagged in for baking recipes a lot. So, you know, this winter, get out all of your best cheeses and make a traditional Swiss fondue and use your cherry brandy in it. Or, you know, and I know you make beautiful cakes. You can make a Black Forest ghetto. Cool. All right. So that means what's next? They'll live around the corner. Ooh, we're heading into an aged spirit.
So,
All right. So the American pot still brandy. Okay. So like I said before, everything made from fruit is a brandy, but not everything is an eau de vie. This can never be called an eau de vie because it's made from grapes. So what you have in your glass, it used to be called Oregon brandy. I will give you a little bit of a sneak peek. It's going to be called Oregon brandy again real soon. American pot still brandy is a whole mouthful of words to try to say when you're pulling things on the shelf. So we're going to go back to Oregon brandy. It is, I believe it's 85 proof. Pretty sure it is. I have to look at the label. And it's made from all different kinds of wines that we distill at the distillery. The deal with the Oregon wine brandy is I can't guarantee that it's always going to taste exactly the same, which is, you know, the blessing of being a craft distillery is that there's a lot of joy and celebration in the variation from batch to batch versus if you were a bigger distillery and if there was any variation, you'd be like, excuse me, my Jim Beam doesn't taste like the last Jim Beam. How dare you? So I can guarantee that while it doesn't taste the same from batch to batch, it will always be delicious. I think I made a point to make sure that you guys got the new blend, and I made sure that I grabbed the newest blend to bring home. So this one has a little bit more fruity and floral notes in my mind as well. There's I believe the wines that were distilled to go into this blend, there's a little bit of Chardonnay, a little bit of Pinot Noir, and just a touch of Muscat. So that little bit of Muscat is what's going to like supercharge some of those like really fruity and floral notes that you'll get through that. Our minimum requirement for the labeling for this is 2 years, but if memory serves, this was closer to 4 or 5 as far as the total age for what went into this bottle. For those of you that aren't distillers, what that means is when you talk about the label age, when we say that this bottle of brandy is at least 2 years old, that means that every drop of liquid that went into that bottle had to be at a very minimum exactly 2 years old. But that doesn't mean that we can't add a bunch of older stuff in there if we want to. And then also, if you're doing that blend, if you had a drop of 2-year-old brandy in there, and then the entire rest of the volume was 20 years old, too bad the youngest alcohol that was in that blend is 2 years old. The whole batch is now 2 years old. So when you're making those decisions on what's best for the blend, what you're responsible for as far as your labeling goes, those are the kind of decisions that you're making. We put it at 2 because that gives us a lot more leeway and creative space to make sure that this Oregon brandy is always going to be exceptional. But generally speaking, it's always kind of much older than that. We don't actually do our wine brandy from grapes. It's one of the handful of things that we don't actually handle from raw material all the way through. We buy bulk wine from a number of different distilleries in the region, or a number of different wineries in the region. It's never the same winery. Generally speaking, it's always wine that's been maybe struggling a little bit. And good news that even if maybe it's struggling too much to be bottled and sold, it still makes really wonderful and really beautiful brandies. So it's a really convenient place for wineries to still get some of their money out of all of their hard work. And then we get to age it in French limousine oak casks and then share it with all of you. This brandy, because of the style that it's made, would be more similar to an Armagnac versus a cognac. but it is definitely not an Armagnac. There are a lot of very serious rules in regards to being able to call something an Armagnac versus a cognac, which is why this is American pot still brandy. It's American wine that's been distilled in a pot still. But you can use it in all of those recipes that call for cognac and Armagnac because it's going to be very similar.
I absolutely want to cook with this. It's so good.
Yeah.
I'm like, I foresee French onion soup happening very soon.
Oh man, I can tell you from experience, makes a great French onion soup.
This is wonderful.
I feel like this would really speak to whiskey drinkers just because of the aging, and it really, the nose of it kind of comes off like a grain whiskey almost, which I really, really like.
That's kind of the fun thing about working with all the different grape varietals. You get to learn through the distillation process kind of what's hiding beneath. You know, it's certainly, you know, fairly elaborate tasting notes exist within the whiskey world, absolutely. But wine is extra known for that. And all those things that a really good sommelier will be telling you that they find in that wine. One, they absolutely do smell and taste those things, even if it's hard for us to kind of grasp those out of any particular vintage. But through the distillation process, because distilling is essentially concentrating, you actually get the opportunity to tap into those flavors and aromas on a greater scale. So you might not have been able to pick up the like tutti frutti jackfruit of any particular vintage, but distill it and all of a sudden you're like, oh my gosh, I understand what they were talking about now. Understand when they were talking about like a chalky mineral quality that will translate into the spirit. So you get to really get that microscope view of what each individual vintage really has to offer from a flavor perspective, and then amplify it in the glass. Any other brandy questions? Wine brandy questions? Well, I said this is a great place. I don't want to rush you. We just tried this, so I don't want to rush you guys. But is anybody have any other distilling questions? Any Clear Creek questions? Any Pacific Northwest questions? I don't want to hurry you through your tasting experience of trying the Oregon wine brandy before we move on to the raspberry.
Can you talk about your barrels?
Sure. When it comes to the wine brandy, we're using 350 liter limousine French oak casks. The quality of spirit that you get out of a barrel really depends on the quality of the barrel itself. So we're actually buying wine grade French oak casks and not spirits grade French oak cask. The difference is that the wood grain itself is much tighter in a wine grade cask. It's a more expensive, but it's a higher quality barrel. And because we're dedicating ourselves to making sure that we're providing you with the absolute best spirit we can, that means that we have to buy the absolute best barrels that we can as well. So that really does translate directly over. If you don't spend the money on a high quality barrel, you're not gonna see all of that hard work come out, you know, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 years later. And what a disappointment to come down the road 10 years and be like, oh gosh, I wish I would have spent that extra $400 on this barrel, because it really could have been exceptional.
So does that mean
Go ahead.
Toasted but not charred?
Yeah, medium toast. We're a medium toast house all the way through.
But not char.
Not char.
Okay.
That goes for everything Clear Creek, including the McCarthy's American Single Malt. The McCarthy's is aged 100% in Oregon oak, and that Oregon oak is also medium toast. The only thing that is heavy char in the entire building are the ex-bourbon casks that we use to finish the Old Delicious apple brandy, and then are a part of the Trails End program, the Trails End bourbon program.
So because of the tighter grain in the barrel, there's less interaction between the liquid and the barrel, so you get less oak influence in the juice than you would
think of it more as there is more interesting stuff that the spirit has access to, and not necessarily that it can't get through the wood grain to get after it. So the tighter grain means there's less cellulose and more extractives. So you get a heightened sense of those baking spices that you're more likely to get from a French oak cask. Oregon oak has things like burnt orange peel and Madagascar vanilla. American oak has lots of things like fatty nuts and lime and coconut in it. French is known for all of its warm baking spices, and Hungarian even more so. But you're also, when you spend that extra money on an expensive wine cask, you're also going to make sure that those staves have been properly air dried, and the drying process will leach, or they stay out in the yard and they get rained on and they go through the seasons. That process will leach some of the more aggressive and drying tannins out of that wood, and then once it's made into a barrel, you get all these rich, beautiful sweet characteristics from the caramelized wood sugar from the toasting process. If you buy a cheaper barrel, it's probably air dried for a lot less time. It's maybe even been kilned, which changes the kinds of aromas that you're going to get out of that barrel.
Yeah, this hot still brandy is just really wonderful. I could sip on that for a long time.
I'm glad you like it.
Yeah.
You reuse your barrels?
Yep, absolutely. We actually, so Daniel keeps bringing up the McCarthy's. The McCarthy's is the first American single malt. It was first released in 1996, and we actually have still the barrel that aged the first batch of McCarthy's in it. There are a lot of really great things to be said for having some neutral barrels or more neutral barrels in your system, but in your aging system. But to be honest, I'm continually surprised at what an older barrel really has to offer in regards to flavor and aroma to any given spirit. I have pulled apple brandy from French oak casks that are 20 some odd years old, maybe 25 years old. And while there is not a whole lot of color in that spirit, I've taken samples into Joseph's office and been like, try this. And it doesn't look like it's particularly old. There is always going to be some color in it. But it still is able to develop a lot of flavors and aromas. I think a lot of times people get tricked into thinking that, one, the age always makes something more valuable and makes something better. And then also they key into the age is better by looking at the color of the spirit in the glass. And if they get that rich, dark color, they're like, oh, this must be the really good stuff. And really only 50% of the magic of properly barrel aging something is about those extractives, is about that color. There's so much more that happens in a cask. The oxidation, the loss of the angel share. Pardon me. Excuse me. You get the concentration of all the good stuff in the cask, and all that stuff is outside of the extractives.
You get
Phew, took a wrong sip there.
You gonna survive?
Yeah.
Oh, good.
I had to mute my mic for a second.
Yeah. Do you guys get a pretty large angel share? I mean, I don't know what the full swing of your climate change is, but
we do. Goodness, I'm gonna have to take a break for a second.
Hey, Jane, have we done a tasting of the McCarthy single malt?
no.
But that
Mhm.
might be in the works, just hang tight.
Terrific. I would like to try it, so that would be nice.
Phew. Yeah, when I'm talking to Vadim, this was hopefully maybe the first of many. Clear Creek makes like 22 different things. This is mostly just fruit brandy. We actually have the potential to do one of these, but just all different kinds of apple brandies that we make. So that's there, as well as some of the bourbons and single malts and stuff that we make too. So depending on if I've been entertaining enough, we have a lot more stuff that we can talk about.
In preparation, I made a rusty nail tonight. That was my cocktail for this evening with McCarthy's. It was pretty good.
I don't think I've ever had a rusty nail. Can you share your recipe with us?
Oh, it's just drambuie.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. And now it's got a little bit of the cherry that you were talking about, adding that to cocktails. So I
Mhm.
splashed in a little bit. It's great.
Yeah, no, it's good. There's all
The
kinds of
McCarthy's is, yeah, I mean, I'm a huge, so
Well, not to go off track too much, but K&L has the Clear Creek Oda V Palm 8-year-old apple brandy for
Mhm.
$27. So I bought one because I don't know, just taking a $27 seems like, based on what you have here, I think there's
Mhm.
one more bottle left at K&L if anyone else is gonna do it, but seems like it's worth
Yeah,
the
we
risk.
have a 2-year and an 8-year. Both of those are aged in limousine oak as well. And then an Old Delicious apple brandy, which is double bourbon barreled apple brandy. So if we were going to start to dig into the apple brandies, then all of a sudden 6 was going to turn into a lot more tasting samples. And so, when talking to Vadim, he was like, okay, well, maybe let's keep it to just the fruit brandies and then leave an option open to do some deeper dives into some of these other things that we also make. So that's why we've got the set that we have today. In regards to your question about angel share. So angel share is really a reflection of where the barrels have been stored. So depending on whether you lose more water or more ethanol depends on the atmosphere that those barrels are in. If you're in a place like Scotland or where we were previously in Portland, it's a lot more humid and it's a lot more cooler climate. So we were actually losing proof. The water or the air was like, oh my gosh, I am so damp. I have all the water I need, but give me some of that alcohol. And so you're actually losing more alcohol than you were water, which means that we were losing proof. Now that we're on the other side of the mountains, we're in a little bit of the rain shadow. The air is like, oh my God, it's so dry out here. I would do anything for a glass of water. And so we're actually losing more water than we are ethanol. And so we're rising in proof now that we're on the other side of the mountain. I would say that overall, the angel share is just only slightly more on this side of the mountain versus the other. So as far as total volume and alcohol that we're losing, it's about the same, but the proof is changing. It's not so much that I'm really worried or that we as the distilling team are at all worried about changing our barrel entry proof because it's only a slight gain versus a slight loss. But when you're talking about the difference between the aging experience of a cask here in Oregon versus the aging experience of a cask in Louisiana versus the aging experience of a cask in Texas or Colorado, all of those different areas will change and affect the percentage that you lose over time, and therefore affect the access to extractives that the spirit has and how quickly or how slowly you can potentially over extract out of that cask and then ruin whatever you're aging. Because you can actually overage a spirit and make it worse. It just because it's 40 years old doesn't necessarily mean that it's 30 years better than a 10-year-old would have been. Awesome. All right. Well, we are now going to depart from flavors and aromas that you're more used to. These last two are some of our more powerful spirits. There are more flavorful spirits. The framboise, particularly, we very rarely bring out to sample. So you guys are in for a real treat, at least a real treat if you like raspberries. So go ahead and pour that one in your glass.
So for this one, I don't have to have the glass anywhere near my nose, and I can smell it. It's potent, and it doesn't smell like raspberries. I mean, it kind of smells like a raspberry, like a bush, if you will, or whatever they're called, but it doesn't smell like the fruit, raspberry, the fruit itself. Not to me. I'm curious to hear what other people say.
Yeah, I'm curious as well.
the overriding note, I do get a sweet raspberry thing towards the back, but at the front of the nose, the overriding note is like the nori wrappers for sushi.
Yeah,
It's weird.
it is weird, right?
I feel like the framboise smells like a raspberry tastes. So when you smell a raspberry, you just, you smell that sweetness, you smell that fruitiness. But when you taste a raspberry, you get all those kind of, herbal, almost kind of bitter raspberry notes. Maybe kind of like that little kind of green stemmy note that a raspberry might have. And so the aroma to this always smells like what I am tasting when I eat one. But it is crazy potent. The minute that we bring raspberries into the distillery, it's like, if you can kind of imagine like Willy Wonka's workshop, where it's just like all these like bright, colorful powders are kind of whooshing out of all these stovepipes. I always imagine as soon as the raspberries come to the distillery, that like if anybody was watching with like special Willy Wonka glasses from outside on the street, all of a sudden just like all this red powder would just like essentially escape from the distillery, because it's so overwhelming to have that many raspberries in the distillery. And it just escalates over time. Just when we're crushing the fruit, it's overwhelming. During the fermentation, it's like you can't get away from it. And then finally through the distillation, it's like, oh my God, like I'm gonna get a headache from the amount of smell of raspberries in this building. When we're distilling the framboise, that's usually when we get a hummingbird in the building. I think out of the last 5 years, 4 out of 5 years, we've managed to get a hummingbird in the building. But they only come in the distillery when we're specifically when we're distilling raspberry. So when I was talking about how much fruit it takes to make a bottle, and earlier I said it takes 20 pounds of pears to make a single fifth of our pear brandy. To make a pint of raspberry brandy, it takes 80 pounds of raspberries. There's not that much fermentable, despite raspberries being really sweet, there's actually not that much fermentable sugar in a raspberry. And so it takes an inordinate amount of raspberries in order to make it. And raspberry fermentations are also really finicky. We're, I think, one of 3 distilleries in the United States that will actually bother with a from scratch raspberry fermentation. All of the framboise that you will get in Europe are actually, they would be called a Geist, which is German for ghost. So they're actually soaking the raspberries in a neutral brandy and then redistilling that to get access to the raspberry flavor. We are kind of madmen for doing it from ferment. Raspberries are not the easiest to work with. Not only is there not a lot of sugar available in a raspberry, but they're also really acidic, which means it's even harder for the yeast to stay alive in there, because they're like, oh, it's spicy in here. And then also the fermentation will happen really quickly, mostly because the fruit is usually like, warm from the sun when it comes in. And if you don't manage the cap, if you don't manage the temperature of that fermentation, because the yeast are already under stress because of the pH of the mash, they will start pumping out isoamyl like crazy. And that is the smell and flavor of fake bananas. And so you might not know it during the fermentation that that's happened to you, but when you start loading the stills full of this beautiful fermented raspberry mash in order to make your framboise that's cost you so much in fruit, and then the first distillate starts to come out and you're like, this doesn't smell or taste like raspberries, this smells like Runts candy and fake banana flavor, and then all of your beautiful raspberry brandy has to go down the drain. That's why nobody does it from ferment anymore. We will do twice daily punch downs and come in on the weekends and do everything we can to make sure that the down payment on a house amount of raspberries that we're fermenting don't go sideways on us. But we only make 20 cases a year or so the framboise. It's something that's really special and really important to us that we continue to do, because we want to continue that relationship with our local farmers. And it's such a really wonderful and beautiful spirit that is worth taking the time and the effort to make sure that there's always a bottle on the shelf somewhere. As far as using it in cocktails, because it's so powerful, it doesn't take a whole lot, which means that even though we're asking $55 a bottle for a pint of it, If you want to make a beautiful raspberry martini with this, it takes like 5 drops of framboise in your shaker to make a really beautiful raspberry martini. If you have a mister that you put it in, so you can just do like a spray over the top of a cocktail, like or a rinse, like an absinthe rinse or an absinthe spray, you can do the same thing with this framboise and really add a lot of character and a lot of flavor to any of your cocktails, or to like the inside of a croissant before you put something super yummy on the inside of it.
With that, what else would you put in there? Brie, like what else is going in? I really want to know more.
I've actually never done it. What I have used the framboise for is to make marshmallows. So homemade marshmallows are actually dead simple as long as you don't mind torturing your KitchenAid. And apparently I don't mind because I've only had my KitchenAid for like 8 years and I've had to rebuild the inside of it once already. But you can do that with all of these brandies. They're so flavorful. You can swap them out, like like we use vanilla all the time in baked goods. You can do the same thing with these brandies. And so in the recipe for the marshmallows, instead of adding the vanilla, I added the framboise and made homemade raspberry marshmallows.
But this would be spectacular in brownies.
Mm-hmm. It comes over really well in chocolate cake as well. I've done that one. It's really super yummy in chocolate cake. You can add quite a bit of alcohol in a baked good. It will start to change the texture of the baked good. So depending on what you're going for, you have to potentially moderate it. But because the framboise is so powerful, you can still get plenty of raspberry character in there without starting to change the chemistry of your baked item and changing the texture.
Totally gonna follow up with you on that for my next thing, by the way.
Oh, what, marshmallows or?
No, just other baked goods.
Oh, sure, yeah.
Marshmallows, so fun.
Yeah, no, I'm currently, I have to be in a wedding at the end of the month, so I'm currently not allowed to do any baking, but I love baking. Any other comments? Raspberry brandy?
Just thanks for sharing it, because
Oh, no, of course.
obviously you don't make a lot of it, and it's very precious. And thank you for bringing it to us.
Yes, this was of all of the places to have the opportunity to share it with. There was never a question in our minds that this was one of those times where it's like 100% we're going to send those bottles out. It's not something that we pack in our bags regularly, but Anna has told me such wonderful things about all of you, and I was like, no, this is going to be the group that's really going to appreciate the hard work and energy that goes into making these things. So
It is definitely appreciated.
I love it too, and I look forward to trying different cocktails with it and things. I love it.
Yeah, and I like your tip about putting it in a mister and then misting it over drinks. I could see that. I could even see that misting it over brownies, Jane, so you don't even have to bake it into the brownies. So
I'm throwing it in the ganache. I'm gonna make it happen.
To keep the yeast happy with this one, do you have to add enzymes or anything crazy to the ferment or anything? No?
nope.
Okay.
Yeah, I just put a full ounce in a mister. This mister.
Yeah,
You
Joe,
get
for the
applause
win.
for that one.
Yeah,
Well
Joe.
done.
Woo. So as we get to the last dram, everybody pour something and come back on camera so we can take a picture. We just want to thank you, Caitlin, so much for joining us tonight and bringing us all these really incredible fruit brandies. So everybody smile at the camera for us. Yeah, I think I got it. Of course, I didn't leave my other thing open, so I'll check. If it sucks, I'll make another one.
So
Oh, look, you're all smiling. I'm so excited. Everybody's eyes are open. Okay, we're good.
the last dram And from what it sounded like as you guys were coming in, maybe the one that everybody's been most excited for.
Oh, come on. It was almost green. I was, when he told me what we were doing, I was like, oh my goodness.
We've heard good things.
So it actually is green. Let me pour some in my glass and I'll show you the bottle. See if the camera actually picks it up. It is actually green. The painting is not necessarily the best background against it. That is all natural green chlorophyll from the Douglas fir buds.
Mhm.
So Clear Creek hasn't invented any of this stuff. All of these brandies have long and beautiful histories. Realistically, humans remember and forget enough over time that really there hasn't been an original idea in centuries. This Douglas fir eau de vie has a cousin and an inspiration. I'm going to probably butcher the pronunciation because it's been far too long since I've heard Steve say it, but it's eau de vie de bourgeon de sapin, which is French brandy made from pine needles. And so he had that, and this was intended to be a love letter to the Pacific Northwest in that instead of pine needles, it was Douglas fir buds. It has to be the buds of the tree. If you were to pick the Doug fir needles, it is far too sappy and far too tree-like. But with those beautiful fresh springtime buds, you get all of these wonderful citrus and like fruity and floral kind of notes that come along with come along on the ride with the Christmas tree. And so you get this beautiful kind of snapshot of what a Pacific Northwest Doug fir forest is in a glass. The entire process is, we actually just finished this last year's harvest. The buds are actually only viable for 3 to 5 days, depending on the weather every year. Usually Doug fir harvest is sometime around the Memorial Day weekend. That's, you know, sometimes it's earlier, sometimes it's later. This year, the last Doug fir harvest day was actually Monday. So Garrett Trotter, our distiller, who is an amazing young man, he's been with us for 2 years, and shame on me for not having mentioned him sooner in this recording, but he is absolutely wonderful. He actually designed the blend that went into our recent Oloroso sherry cask finish of the 6-year McCarthy's. So he brings a lot of really important qualities to the team, even though he's been he's only been in the industry for 2 years. He's a great fit, and we're certainly happy to have him as part of the team. So Garrett and I went up to the mountain on Monday, and after 6 hours, we managed to pick a whopping 14 pounds of buds. It's essentially like picking popped popcorn off of the ends of tree branches. And we have a running joke that Doug fir buds managed to defy physics, because in all of our years of picking Doug fir buds for this brandy, we've never seen a full bucket ever. They managed to, you get a bucket about 2/3 full of buds, and then as you add more buds in the bucket, the weight just continues to compress them. So while your bucket will continue to get heavier and heavier and heavier, it never ever gets more than 2/3 full, which is super depressing. We work with the Hood River Forest Service, and we get a foraging permit every year, and we harvest on an organic tree farm, and it's a lumber tree farm. So it has an 85-year harvest cycle. And since we don't go to any great length to bring out ladders or anything like that, so we're only picking the buds that grow from, eye level or so or lower. And good news for us, none of those trees turn into lumber that you can build a house or a really beautiful chair out of. So they don't mind that we're keeping the trees from getting so wide that you can't drive down all the wonderful bike and jogging trails that they've built throughout that forest. So it's a real win-win, I think, for all of us. We want to make sure that we continue to harvest those buds sustainably. We harvest the buds and bring them back to the distillery and dump them straight into the brandy. If you wait too long, they'll start to oxidize and grow weird stuff. So it's really important that as soon as they get off the tree, we can get them into the brandy as soon as possible. Within 2 days, you start to see this really awesome stratification of color within the steeping tank. So if you were to take a sample of the brandy at the very top of the tank, it would still be clear. But as you get towards the bottom and you kind of like move the buds around, all of a sudden this like rich forest green kind of starts to mix into all of the brandy. It's incredibly interesting to watch. We always try to get a video of it to post it on Instagram. It doesn't come across on video very well, unfortunately. It's one of the few treats that you really have to see live. Once the buds are in the brandy, they sit there and steep and extract all of the flavors and all of the color from the buds. We get the buds off of the brandy, and then that gets redistilled. The next year portion of the buds that get picked get added into that redistilled Douglas fir brandy in order to make sure that we keep that pretty green color. Like I said, that is all natural green chlorophyll from the Doug fir buds that comes across as green in your glass and in the bottle. The reason it's 95.46 proof, 2 reasons. One is science, one is funny. So the science reason is there is so many oils that are extracted from the Doug fir buds that in order to keep it clear, we have to keep it at a much higher proof. If we were to bring the proof down, and then it would go really hazy, and then we would probably need to go ahead and filter that, and then you would lose all of those flavors and aromas. And so it was important for us to make sure that we keep that color and all of those oils in there. So that's why it's at an elevated proof. The reason it's a 4-digit proof is because, and it goes the same with all of our fruit liqueurs, they all have 4-digit proofs. We would make something and we would bring it to Steve and be like, Steve, you asked us to make you a cranberry liqueur. Here it is. And he'd taste it and he'd be like, that's great. Make exactly that. And so a sample of that liquid that would then be sent out to ETS, and they would do an official proof on it. And they'd say, okay, this cranberry liqueur sample you sent us is 39.12 proof. And so Steve would be like, well, that's what it's going to be because I liked it the way it tasted when you brought it to me. So much to the chagrin of the bottling plant, anything that isn't 80 proof usually has a weirdo proof because Steve wanted it to be exactly the way that it had been presented, exactly the way that he had fallen in love with it. The cool thing about the Doug fir is that you can use it in pretty much any gin cocktail in a little bit or a lot, depending on how much you like. The plays really well with all of those flavors and aromas. So even if you just, you know, again, get your mister out, do a glass rinse, it really adds this extra note of intrigue and a note of depth to any of your gin cocktails. I really like it in a Doug fir martini. We call it the Firtini. You use like a ½ ounce pour in with your vodka. It still manages to give it maybe like a teasing hint of being green. And then we suggest that you add a little bit of maple syrup as well instead of your sweet vermouth. Most people have some maple syrup in their cupboard, so you're not having to make some simple syrup or anything like that. You just dump some maple syrup in there, shake it up really good, pour out your martini to have your Douglas fir taste of the forest, taste of camping martini.
There's the
and then as far as the thing that I've baked with this, in case that's the question that you're going to ask, Anna, I don't know if you guys have ever made a grasshopper pie or heard of a grasshopper pie. It's one of the old school super fun ones that you don't see in diners very often. But instead of using the creme de menthe, you can use the Doug fir, and it's super good.
That sounds.
Comes out of it's a freezer pie kind of a deal, but it's like heavy cream, or you melt marshmallows with some heavy cream, and then you're supposed to add the creme de menthe, and then I think maybe fold in some whipping cream before you put it in the graham cracker shell and then freeze it. But instead of the creme de menthe, put in Doug fir. It's amazing.
I was actually going to say I want to try that now. First off, but there's a cocktail I like to make with, I know we won't mention other brands because we can't mention other brands while we're recording, but with some other brands.
You can't? You're not going to hurt my feelings.
No, I'll text you later. It's fine. But with like a smoky whiskey and then a little bit of a different Douglas fir liqueur and then a little bit of maple syrup and a few drops of a chocolate bitters. Ooh. And I call it a walk in the woods because it's sort of like you get like that pine needle sort of smell, and it like bark and warm sun on all of that. It's freaking awesome. So now I want to try that with some McCarthy's with this maple syrup and a little bit of chocolate bitters and see I feel like that will be kind of it'll be strong, but I'll have to.
Yeah, please text that to me because I also
Yeah.
want to try that with the McCarthy's.
Yeah, absolutely.
That sounds really good.
As a side note, the McCarthy's also makes a really good grasshopper pie if you do a dark chocolate drizzle on top of it. Seriously, I do a lot more baking and cooking with all of our spirits than I do making cocktails at home. I was just kind of shame on me, but you know, do what you love.
Yeah, if you can't cook with it, you shouldn't drink it.
I actually made, when I was in my marshmallow phase, we used to make 7 different kinds of grappa, different varietals of grappa. Unfortunately, the conversion from direct fire to steam means that we can't make grappa anymore. But I would do a red wine reduction and like essentially boil it down until it was a syrup, and then add a little bit of grappa to it, and then use that to make red wine marshmallows. And then I dipped them in chocolate and gave this away for Christmas one year.
Yeah, it looks like everybody on the camera is drooling.
We should have requested marshmallows with this. I didn't think that was going to be the like snack request, but here we are.
That was like, that was the reason I got the KitchenAid. I'd always wanted to make them from scratch. And so there was like a 2-year period where I was like, I can turn anything into a marshmallow. I made pumpkin spice ghosts one year for Halloween out of marshmallows.
I've
I
used
like-
pureed sweet potato as well, like for that same kind of thing, which is really good. Oatmeal stout beer, also really good. Like,
Ooh.
I want to do more booze. That sounds fun.
Anna has also had a marshmallow phase.
Yes, I've also had a marshmallow.
Yeah, so we used to make a Mirabelle plum, and one of our harvest interns, our first year in Hood River, Dwight Monahan, he brought in, and I didn't know that he also made homemade marshmallows because I had exited my marshmallow phase. It didn't come up, and we had a cookie exchange, and he came in with Mirabelle plum marshmallows, which is a plum brandy that we don't make anymore, and blew everybody's socks off. So I refuse. That's Dwight's recipe. I will not make Dwight's Mirabelle plum marshmallows. That's all him. It's his genius. I'm not going to tread on it.
That sounds awesome.
So yeah, that's kind of, fruit brandies in Clear Creek Distillery. Like I said, we make a whole bunch of other things. We've got 7 different fruit liqueurs that are made from a neutral wine brandy that we soak real whole fruit in. We press it off and add a little bit of sugar. That's it. It's the same thing that grandmas have been making in kitchens for centuries. We just smack a label on it and sell it at the liquor store. It's dead simple, and it's meant to really showcase, again, all this beautiful fruit that we have access to. We've mentioned several times the McCarthy's, which is the first American single malt, in 3, 6 single barrel PX cask finish and Oloroso cask finish. We also have the Clear Creek vodka, which is a vodka made from 100% apples. Timberline vodka made from grain and apples, which is an independent brand. We have a series of Pacific Northwest finished Kentucky sourced bourbons that we work on called the Trails End line, that has an 8-year-old in Oregon oak, a 10-year-old in Oregon oak casks, and an 8-year-old finished in apple brandy casks. And then a series of apple brandies, the 8 in French oak, and the double bourbon barreled apple brandy, the Old Delicious. So for a team of 3 people in one small facility, we managed to pump out like upwards of 30 different items, which seems like a lot when I say them all out loud, but we're kind of always working on like 3 to 5 at a time as we kind of make our way through the year and through the seasons. Oh, and the Dale DeGroff Amaro and Aperitivo.
That's so cool.
Which are so new, I forget about them.
Have you guys got fruits that you have considered turning into brandy that you haven't gotten around to yet? Or are you still looking to stay pretty local?
So I will tell you one, we're always experimenting. You might see a couple new Clear Creek labels coming out in the next 6 months, which we're really excited about. So there's always something new. You can't not be always experimenting with something. So there's a couple new things that I know that are going to be coming out. there's a bunch of stuff that I've always wanted to do. But I will tell you one that Clear Creek tried again and again and again, and I've tried a couple times just like on my own because I didn't really want to believe it was true. Blueberries. No dice. No dice on blueberries. I know when we think about blueberries, we think about how yummy and delicious they are, but mostly we think about how yummy and delicious a blueberry muffin is. And blueberry muffins are almost always made with dry blueberries. When you actually, the next time you eat a blueberry, I would like to ask you to really think about if you're actually tasting anything. Because turns out you're really not. There's texture and there's sweetness. But they're not abundantly flavorful. And Clear Creek has tried to make brandy out of them. Clear Creek has tried to make liqueurs out of them. There's just nothing there. So yeah, always really disappointed with blueberries. We tried and failed.
What about
that-
peach?
Oh,
Peach and strawberry. So I could see someday Clear Creek releasing an apricot. Apricots do a little bit better than peaches. There's a couple problems with peach brandies. One, the first one being that most of the flavors that are going to be in a peach are going to be more water soluble and not alcohol soluble. And they're also a little bit more fragile. So there's not that much flavor that will come through the process to begin with. And the flavors taste a little bit cooked. If we had a vacuum still, and that's really the big problem with having a strawberry eau de vie, those flavors taste cooked. And cooked strawberries still have a lot of potential, right? But when we want a strawberry brandy, and certainly when Clear Creek wants a strawberry brandy, we want it to taste like you're taking a bite of a strawberry, like a bright, fresh strawberry. So if we had a vacuum still, then we would be able to distill at a lower temperature. And I think we would be able to have access to those bright and fresh strawberry flavors and those bright and fresh peach flavors, but we don't have a vacuum still. The other thing with the peach is really a problem of perception, in my opinion. So if somebody was to buy a bottle of peach brandy, the vast majority, if 100 people bought a bottle of peach brandy and they never had it before, and they weren't an experienced brandy connoisseur, you're always going to be disappointed, because what you're going to expect is this really rich, in your face peach candy taste and flavor, and a peach eau de vie is never going to be able to deliver that. And so you're going to be like, oh, that's not what I want. It doesn't taste like peachos. Bummer. So that's kind of the other thing, is like this gap in perception and what you're going to get. People are going to want it to be sweet. People are going to want it to be candy and peach flavored. And it's going to be a really beautiful floral, but lightly aroma and lightly flavored peach brandy. Apricots translate much better, so you get that really punch up of flavor like you do with the blue plum. But with peaches, it's a little harder to get to.
Yeah.
And watermelon, same thing.
wow.
But I've had a couple watermelon eau de vies. It would be a little bit better on a vacuum still, but it's kind of the whole joke with LaCroix, when you're like, LaCroix is like somebody yelling at you from the other end of the house, like, grapefruit. Like that's what LaCroix tastes like. Watermelon brandy, it's the same thing. It's like you're tasting some alcohol, and then somebody 3 doors down is like, watermelon, and you're like, oh yeah, I get that.
That's hilarious. So I launched a poll to see what everybody's favorite pour was tonight. Would you like to take a guess as to what the winner was?
Oh, me?
Yes.
Oh gosh. I'm gonna hope that it's the American pot still brandy, the Oregon brandy.
Ding ding ding.
We used to, poor thing, it used to sell out when we called it Oregon brandy, and now that it's called American pot still brandy, nobody understands what it is and it doesn't sell out anymore. So I'm glad to know that it's not because we've somehow managed to let people down in the blends, and and that it still tastes great.
It's kind of a shame. I would buy it no matter what.
Well, it is going to be called Oregon brandy again fairly soon.
Well, there we go. Hopefully that will fix the perception problem. I was kind of curious, you said that because you don't do direct heat, you can't do grappa anymore.
Mhm.
Do you have plans to go back to doing any direct heat, or will you stay with steam?
Yeah, we're gonna stay with steam. It's mostly a safety issue. Because direct fire is, and there's a reason nobody does direct fire stills anymore, or at least there's a reason that only a handful of people do direct fire stills anymore. We did have a fire at one point in time. It was totally preventable, but I'm not going to get into that. But having a giant natural gas burner under like a piece of equipment producing high proof alcohol, like maybe not the brainiest idea. The reason that we can't do it now that we can convert it into steam is because when we were direct fire, the stills still work essentially like a double boiler, like you're trying to reheat chocolate or trying to melt chocolate on your stovetop. In that the steam fills up a jacket, and that jacket then moves that heat from the steam and then into the mash. When we were direct fire, we had a natural gas burner, and then those jackets were full of water and with a little bit of area for steam to build up and build up pressure on the inside of it, and that translated the heat into the mash. But because it was just boiling city water, what we had installed on the stills, I don't know if this is just our term or if this is the technical term, but we called it the fluffer. And, and because what you could do is you could turn this valve and it would direct inject a mass of steam from the steam within that jacket into the mass of pumice in the still. And then you would bump up the heat and you would bump up the moisture within that mass, and you had more access to get out as much of the ethanol and the flavors and aromas in that pumice as you possibly could. Because we've moved over to a boiler and to steam, in order to keep our very expensive, very nice, if it explodes, we all die boiler, we have to have a handful of boiler chemicals that live within that boiler, like anti-corrosives and oxygen scavengers and stuff like that. None of that stuff will get over to the other side, to the production side, because of how the stills work, which means we had to get rid of those fluffers. And so without being able to direct inject that live steam into that mass, when we were only getting, you know, I told you what the conversion is from 60 gallons of pear mash into high proof distillate, and that was already pretty depressing as a 60 gallons to like 3 gallons conversion. When you load a still full of grappa pumice, we're trying to get like 1.5 gallons, 2 gallons out of it. And without the ability to inject that heat into that massive pumice, like maybe 0.5 gallon to maybe 1 gallon if it was a really, really good pumice and we'd managed to convince a winemaker that they don't need to press their wine that hard. And so it's just what was already a lot of work for not a lot of product is pretty untenable without that ability. So that's why.
And that makes sense. Kind of a shame though, because I've heard that your grappa was pretty fabulous. So.
Oh no, it was. I used to tell people in the tasting room all the time, it's like grappa gets a bad rap, and if there was ever a time for you to fall in love with the category, it would be at our tasting room table. We still make the Muscat grappa. We actually buy those grapes, which is why we still make it, because it is a very, very wet pumice. Because we actually handle that fruit and do those ferments ourselves. So we're not trying to make sure that we get all the wine that we can into each individual vintage. We're after it for the pumice, and so we very, very lightly press that, so it's very juicy, so we're able to actually get access to all that to all that alcohol and still make it a viable product. But we don't have the time, the space, or the energy to be able to buy 7 different kinds of grapes and ferment and distill them from start to finish into grappas in the middle of pear season, especially when we're only barely keeping up with pear brandy demand as it is, without adding more people or more shifts and more tanks and more stills. So
Sounds challenging.
it's a fun puzzle though. I mean, Anna knows. It's a fun puzzle to work out all the different pieces from raw materials coming in and finished goods going out and all the things that have to happen in between. If you love spreadsheets and Tetris, you should become a craft distiller.
So I've been going through your web page the whole evening.
Oh, I'm sorry.
I don't know if you noticed how distracted I was by, I listening, and then I'm fascinated. You guys have so much stuff on there, and I could imagine we could do 5 tastings and probably not catch everything that you do.
Yeah, I mean, Hood River Distillers is essentially its own. I mean, we might as well be a distributor. We just only distribute our stuff. So I've mentioned all the stuff that comes out of the Clear Creek facility, but our sister distillery up in Seattle, Big Gin, makes a beautiful London Dry gin. He has a couple different age formats and then some fun single barrels that he's released. I think he sold one Big Gin aged in an ex vermouth barrel as a single barrel not too long ago. So Alex Myers, who is the head distiller up at Captive Spirits, he does some really, really beautiful gin things.
Nice. So
we may or may not have a barrel of McCarthy's that's aging in a gin barrel as well, because he released a gin that was aged in a McCarthy's barrel.
Wow. So where do we find your stuff? I mean, I've looked around. That's another thing I've been doing all night.
Mhm.
And there are some items you can find here and there, but I don't see your big selection anywhere.
So we
here.
don't have an online retailer that carries everything. I know K&L has a great deal available. I would say for an online purchases, they're your best bet in California. We do have a distributor in California, Winebow, and they do a great job. California is a huge state, and because our portfolio is so massive, no liquor store really has the time or space to carry. I mean, if they carried every HRD product, it would be beyond a whole shelf and then some.
Exactly.
So they're trying to curate and pick and choose what they think their customers want, what they're interested in. And I know, Anna, you're in Washington, but I believe most of you are from California. I see some nods. So yeah, if you're, I think a great deal of our stuff is in Total Wine on the shelves. Brandy's kind of hard to find, so you might need to ask for help to find wherever they hide the brandy section. But a lot of our stuff will be in Total Wine. But for an online retailer, K&L is the best. And if there's something that you're interested in and you can't find it, they've been a long-standing friend of the distillery. But we totally understand why they can't have every SKU. But if it was something you're interested in, then they could certainly special order it in from the distributor and make it available. I mean, I can't make any promises for them, but I think it's pretty reasonable that if you called them up and asked them pretty please, they would consider pulling in a case for you.
Okay, thanks. And then, but we can't order directly from the distillery. That's what it's
No, we can't. Direct to consumer shipping is, I mean, all of the alcohol laws are up to each individual state, and things post-prohibition, every state had some real interesting opinions on how that should work post-prohibition, and nobody's really updated or considered updating any of those laws since. And so nothing's really been updated to accommodate for any kind of e-commerce. Those things are being brought up in legislatures. Those things are being challenged in courts to have more access to direct-to-consumer shipping and to make it easier to have online e-commerce from state to state to state. There are some like Drinkly and Sealbox that you can get in a lot of places, but still not everywhere. So there's not one online service to rule them all, because all of the tapestry of liquor laws across the country make it pretty difficult to be able to do that.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
I have a question about glassware. Just out of habit, I use my Glencairns for this, but the big thing I noticed with a lot of the brandies is because of the unaged nature of them, the volatiles pour off so much that it reminds me of drinking something off the still, in that it's still got, it's still a high heads is what you would expect from the smell, but then you taste it and there's none of that's there because of the cuts. And so is it just, for the most part, would you be better with most of your unaged stuff to have a more open glass to allow those volatiles to escape better, in order so you're not getting hit with that kind of, punch in the face?
I think I would say I would leave that up to the consumer, really. We use tulips to do all of our heads cuts and to do all of our tasting at the distillery. And we actually have a set of grappa glasses, one, because we used to make a bunch of grappas, but two, they work really well at concentrating and funneling that aroma up to your nose, right? Because so they're a tulip shaped, so they kind of come in and then they're tight at the top. But I would say it's whatever your preference is. I know some people really like that kind of blast in the face. And so they would be really interested in concentrating that even more. Like, yeah, give me more of it. Versus somebody that's like, no, I really want to be able to have the opportunity to smell what's underneath. It's kind of the same thing with, you know, there's different things between brandy and whiskey, but they're also kind of the same. Like I love pouring a glass of whiskey and smelling and tasting it immediately, right? Get my nose in there, figure out what I'm finding, give it a taste. And then, you know what I extra love? And I do this all the time at work. I'll set that glass and I will walk away. I'll walk away from it. And then 15, 20 minutes later, I'll come back and I'll smell that glass and I'll taste that whiskey again, because the experience is completely different. You're smelling and you're picking up all these different things. You're smelling the, you know, the residue that's now dried on the inside of the glass. So you have access to like kind of what remains of the whiskey once it leaves that's stuck to the glass. All of those, maybe some of those sulfur components, some of those heads, some of the acetaldehyde, maybe some of that's blown off. And then you get this kind of like deeper access into what's available in that glass. I'm always intrigued by the difference between something that you've just poured and something 15, 20 minutes, 30 minutes later in the glass. And if you're interested in spirits and you like diving deeper into what they have to offer, I encourage you to try it at least one. It's always really interesting what you'll find when you give it that break. Also, in regards to the website, they're working on it. We used to have a Clear Creek Distillery website. We will again. Right now, it just reverts you to a handful of pages on Clear Creek within the HRD website. So there's more fun information coming soon.
Always cool.
Well, I do want to take a moment to thank you guys all so much, to all of your wonderful comments, all of your amazing questions. Huge shout out again to Anna for introducing me to Vadim, and then giving me the opportunity to be able to talk to all of you about all of the brandies that we make and the fruits that make them possible. So follow us on Instagram, because we're a small company and we can't be bothered to have lives. Joseph O'Sullivan runs the McCarthy's Single Malt Instagram page. I run the Clear Creek Distillery Instagram page. So if you have any other follow-up questions, feel free to reach out to those Instagram pages. We do watch the messages that come in and are happy to answer questions, whether it's how do you make that? How do you grow that pear in the bottle? Or, hey, I'm in Indiana and I can't find your stuff. What can you do for me? And we will do everything that we can to answer your questions.
I'm still laughing over the barrel roll.
Oh my God, that was so much fun. We actually did that and then we didn't film it. And then I was like, Joseph, there's no way that we can't not do this again and film it. And then and I think it happened, Garrett was actually on his lunch break when Joseph came out with the signature like shenanigans twinkle in his eye. And he was like, you got to roll me in it. I think I can fit in there. You got to roll me. And so he took the maiden voyage. And we had both done it a couple times while Garrett was at lunch. And then by the time Garrett came back from lunch, we were like, we're going to film this. Come here. And so then we spent the next 15 minutes rolling each other in a barrel and filming it. And then Joseph edited together that wonderful video. So as much as there are days when I don't particularly care to be sweating my shirt off digging cherry pits out of a drain in the building, it is a sharp contrast to the days when I get to roll my boss around in a 40-year-old cognac cask. So
it just looked like so much fun.
Oh my God, it was a blast.
Well, I want to also thank you, Caitlin, for joining us this evening. This has been fantastic. I think that everyone has truly appreciated the deep dive into your fruit brandies, and we're looking forward to seeing you again.
Absolutely.
So I'm not going to kick anybody out. We can stay and chat, but I am going to stop the recording. So thanks again for joining us this evening.